Episode 4, 18th Century Gay Clubs. Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Amorous Histories. I'm Annie Harrison. Thank you for joining me to learn more about the history of sex and sexuality. Before we get started, I have to apologise for being such a bad podcast host. I'm finally getting back to things after an unplanned hiatus. Sadly, my aunt passed away at the end of November, and in 2021 she faced cancer and sepsis, so when she caught COVID-19, unfortunately the virus had the upper hand. For someone who isn't a fan of December or January in the first place, this added grief didn't really make for much productivity. To finally ease myself back into podcasting, this episode won't be about Beggars Benison Club as promised. Instead, I'm going to be talking about one of my other favourite historical subjects, molly houses. But the next episode will be on the Beggars Benison. I haven't forgotten about it. Thank you to everyone who has stuck with me so far on social media, the website, and by listening to the podcast. And a special thank you to those who have dropped me kind emails and messages. It's much appreciated. Hopefully, if you're new to Amorous Histories, you'll like what you hear and spread the word. If you haven't already found my social media pages, I am at Amorous Histories on Instagram and Facebook, and at Amorous Histpod on Twitter. You can find the transcripts and sources for each show at amoroushistoriespodcast.wordpress.com. And if you like your podcasts available on YouTube, I've started uploading episodes to my channel, which is also called Amorous Histories. Right, now that's all out of the way, let's talk about 18th century London gays. In 18th century Britain, men who engaged in sexual activity with other men were referred to as mollies and sodomites, amongst many other terms. In this episode, the words molly and mollies will be used in reference to men of the period who had same-sex relationships, as this was the language in use at the time and the term accepted by the men themselves. When it comes to the language used to refer to LGBTQ+ history, generally academics will use the words of the period and place and avoid more modern terms such as gay so as not to mislabel people. However, using words current day audiences understand does make history more accessible to people, so it's about striking the right balance and explaining your terms. Hence, the title of this episode is something widely understandable. This script is adapted from an MA essay I wrote in 2018, where I predominantly referred to the men as engaging in homosexual behaviour. At the time, homosexual was the best word I had to hand, but 4 years on, I'm not sure if that's the right word anymore. Equally, I don't feel comfortable referring to the men featured in this episode as gay beyond the title or intro because I don't know that they were gay. What if they swung every way? Batted for every team? It's not for me to assume that they only felt attracted to other men, and as we'll find out later, they weren't all gold star gays either. Queer tends to be a handy word to refer to anybody not cisgender or straight, but it carries a lot of baggage, and like gay, isn't a label 18th century mollies would associate themselves with. So that leads me back to mollies, and that's what I'm going to stick with. Semantics is such an ever-changing rabbit hole, especially in the LGBTQ+ world, so I'm going to leave it there for now. Many scholars agree that at the start of the 18th century, men who had sex with men, especially those in London, began to develop their own subculture. In his book, Mother Clapp's Molly House, Richter Norton establishes that the mollies' exclusive social gatherings and the use of their own specialised vocabulary, known as the female dialect, demonstrates that a distinct cultural group had emerged. The places in which these exclusive social gatherings occurred were named molly houses. They were pubs, coffee houses, ale houses and taverns, all privately owned houses where mollies could meet to socialise, drink, dance and have sex within the relative safety and privacy of familiar company. As sexual acts between men were illegal throughout the 18th century, molly houses became refuges and sanctuaries for men wishing to express their sexual and romantic desires in a safer environment than the known cruising grounds such as Moorfields or Lincoln's Inn. Molly houses were present in London from the beginning of the 18th century, and they existed across the city. In his book, English Sexualities 1700 to 1800, Tim Hitchcock gives an overview of the establishments available. Quote, "There was Margaret Clapp's house in Holborn, a house in Beech Lane at the heart of the city, another near the Old Bailey, and a fourth next to Newgate Prison. Soho also had a Molly House, as did Charing Cross, Drury Lane and St James's Square in the West End." Perhaps the most famous Molly House was Margaret or Mother Clapp's, because we have the trial reports following the raid on her house in 1725-26. Side note, on their calendar, it was 1725. Side note, on the Georgian calendar, it was February 1725, as their calendar year went to March. But in our calendar, how we understand it now, it would be February 1726, which is why we refer to it as being 1725-26. Her premises was one of the most popular Molly houses in the 1720s. There would be music, dancing, and drinks in the larger main room, and apparently she provided beds in all of the other rooms as well. Typically, there were 30 or 40 patrons a night, with Sunday nights being the most popular. Mother Clapp was a married woman who used her husband's property as a coffee house and a Molly house. After the raid, she was charged and found guilty of keeping a so-called disorderly house. She was sentenced to stand in the pillory in Smithfield Market, to pay a fine and spend 2 years in prison. There is no record of what happened to her after she entered prison. We don't know why she ran a Molly house, whether she benefited financially or just enjoyed it. Richter Norton suggests that we could think of her as one of history's first fag hags. Molly houses tended to be frequented by men who were part of the working class, employed in various roles such as footmen, gilders, tailors, butchers, milkmen, barbers, postboys, candle makers, blacksmiths and soldiers. The primary accounts of Georgian Molly houses come from either trial reports, contemporary satire, or writings such as Ned Ward's The Mollies Club. It's from these sources that we've learnt about the events that regularly occurred in the Molly houses. Although these sources may contain exaggerations and fabrications, the similarity between them indicates that the events and subjects they detail are often reflective of reality. As Tim Hitchcock notes, historical accounts, whether fact or fiction, are, quote, "the product of cultural imagination in which any kind of identity is given shape, and thus they're valuable when we're discussing illegal, controversial, and underground activity such as same-sex desire." Upon becoming a regular visitor to a Molly house, men would be christened and given a maiden name. Details of this ritual are given in the trial of Julius Caesar Taylor, who was found guilty of keeping a disorderly house and assault upon the body of John Burgess in October 1728. The trial report states, "When any member entered into their society, he was christened by a female name and had a quartern of Geneva, which is gin, thrown in his face. One was called Orange Deb, another Nell Gwyn, and third Flying Horse Moll." Maiden names were often prefixed by a form of Madam or Miss, Molly, Mary or Margaret, Aunt or Auntie, or titles such as Duchess or Princess. The names would indicate occupation, location, and personality traits. Richter Norton has collected many examples of these names, including Madam Blackwell, Miss Kitten, Miss Fanny Knight, Pomegranate Molly, China Mary, Primrose Mary, Dip Candle Mary, Aunt Greer, Aunt May, Aunt England, Queen Irons, the Countess of Chamomile, Lady Godiva, and Princess Seraphina, who deserves her own episode at a later date, I think. Reading this list does make me wonder what my Molly name would be. The men in Molly houses would talk to one another using their maiden names when in each other's private company. They referred to each other generally as sisters, and although this could imply that the Mollys wished to be seen as women, I think it suggests that they saw each other as family, but they were also satirising their contemporary society. Assuming that these men longed to be women would be a rather misinformed conclusion to draw, much like claiming that all drag queens want to be women. We just know that's not true. Much of the other language Mollys used also copied and satirised the religious and heteronormative institutions of the Georgian period. Sexual intercourse was called marrying or a wedding night. The room where couples had sex was called the chapel, and one sexual partner was dubbed husband. In April 1726, Edward Courtney gave evidence against George Whittle, who was accused of keeping a molly house. In the trial, Courtney alleges Whittle had a back room for the mollies to drink in, and a private room betwixt that and the kitchen. There was a bed in the middle room for the use of the company when they have the mind to go there in couples and be married, and for that reason they call that room the chapel. He has helped me to 2 or 3 husbands there. Although George Whittle was acquitted by the jury, this deposition sheds light not only on the physical architecture of a molly house, but also the relationships that took place within them. Further evidence of this activity comes from Samuel Stevens' testimony given at the trial of Mother Clapp's Holborn molly house. They would go out by couples into another room on the same floor to be married, as they called it. The door of that room was kept by Eccleston, who used to stand pimp for them to prevent anybody from disturbing them in their diversions. When they came out, they used to brag in plain terms of what they had been doing. The use of religiously charged language, such as marrying, to refer to sexual intercourse between men could be seen as a provocative mocking of heteronormative Georgian society. Apart from the satirising effect that these slang terms produced, there was also an argument to be made for the mollies wishing to be accepted in everyday life. Why would you name your illegal activity after a religious ceremony that you couldn't take part in as a same-sex couple? By adopting the words associated with heterosexual relationships, were they striving to be accepted and become part of the society that condemned them? We can only theorise. Although the passages I just read imply that some of the sexual relationships formed in molly houses were casual or temporary, there were noted examples of mating or pair bonding, as Norton puts it, including St Dunstan's Kate and Madame Blackwell, who were reported to be deeply in love with one another, as well as Robert Whale and York Horner, who kept a molly house and lived together as a couple. The men who formed loving same-sex relationships used terms of endearment such as special sweetheart, husband, and spouse to refer to their partners. However, despite the use of female names and calling each other sister, there is no recorded use of the term wife between mollies. Following on from the so-called marriages, there are multiple accounts of molly house mock births. One of the most descriptive comes from the publication The Life of Thomas Neaves, the noted street robber, executed at Tyburn on Friday the 7th of February 1728-29. Yes, that was a long title. It says, when a man was formally laid in bed with the usual ceremonies and formalities, the midwife, which they called Mrs. Susanna, attended. The wretch had his intermitting pains, would make wry faces, sometimes squall out, and desires some of them to hold her back, for her pains were grinding and severe, sometimes by intervals smile, sometimes cry out, but at last the mount's in labour, and out jumps a mouse. The lady is delivered of a jointed baby. This account chimes with other reports of mollies acting out birthing scenes and bearing wooden children. Initially, this acted as a striking impression of heterosexuality and what ultimately most societies sees the purpose of life, to reproduce. Richter Norton argues that mock birth is not so much a case of aping heterosexuals or even mimicking women. However, I think given the context, the men were aping and satirising heterosexuals, perhaps in an attempt to understand and take part in the prescribed household structure of husband, wife and child. Thomas Neaves' story of the mock birth continues. The child is handed about where gossips view him and pass their verdict on him. Oh, it's a fine child. It has his daddy's eyes, daddy's nose and chin. I warrant you the father is a good workman, and the mother a good breeder. It does not look as if it was starved in the womb. Madam is her cradle provided, and the gossips bread, cheese, and a cup of good nappy ale, when they chat, drink, and are merry. Just as after a genuine birth, here is the celebration among friends and family, admiring the child and congratulating the parents. Randolph Troombuck argues that the ceremonies of marriage and birth were not religious skepticism. Instead, the molly's principal purpose is to more likely have been the imitation of the lives of women. In this extract, the molly parents are spoken of in terms of mother and father. a very clear mimicry of the idealised heterosexual home. But as I said before, I'm personally not sold on the idea that these men were pretending to be women. Interestingly, records show that some molly houses were the place of constant residence, as well as a place for entertainment for a few select men. One of the men arrested as a consequence of the raid on Mother Clapp's Molly House in 1725 was 43-year-old upholsterer William Griffin. Griffin was lodging in Mother Clapp's house, as well as frequenting it for pleasure at the time of the raid. During his trial for sodomy at the Old Bailey in 1726, Griffin admitted that he had lodged at Clapp's a year and 3/4, but in an apparent attempt to escape prosecution, he claimed he was unaware of the same-sex relationships taking place in that house. He was found guilty of sodomy and hanged at Tyburn on Monday, the 9th of May, 1726. A second man, Thomas Phillips, also lodged at Mother Clapp's for 2 years. However, unlike Griffin, Phillips vanished after the 1725 raid and was never tried for his illegal homosexual tastes. Scholars such as Victor Norton have suggested that Phillips was the molly who supplied the police with the information that led to the raid. Although these men lived and visited in molly houses, we shouldn't assume that they were only sexually and or romantically interested in other men. Of course, a lot of them may have been, but we can't ignore the fact that some of these men would have been attracted to women as well. Victor Norton highlights some of the men who married, consummated their union, and went on to have children, either to put forward the facade of heterosexuality, to fall in line with society's expectations, for economic reasons, or because they wanted to be with the women they married. William Brown, captured in the Moorfields cruising grounds, had been a married man for about 13 years. Gabriel Lawrence had been married for 11 years, but his wife had died 7 years earlier, and he had one child aged 13. George Whittle had been married, but his wife had been dead for 2 years. He had had 2 children, and one of them was still living. William Griffin was married and had several children, but did not live with his wife. He lived at Mother Clapp's. This evidence shows that the men who regularly frequented the molly houses were aware of or actively playing a part in heteronormative Georgian society. Their sexual tastes may have been directed towards men, but some still formed relationships and had sexual intercourse with women. As I said at the start of this episode, we can't assume that the men who went to molly houses didn't also desire and love women. As we all know, sexuality is fluid. So that was a very quick overview of 18th century London molly houses. There is a fair amount of info out there about mollies and molly subculture, so if this has whetted your appetite, definitely check out Victor Norton's publications and website, victornorton.co.uk. If you wanted to, you can also read my essay about molly houses on my academia profile. Just follow the link on my website about page. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, I'm sorry it took so long to get out. If you liked it, you can leave a little review or some stars on your podcast app or website, and let me know what you think your molly name would have been. You should be able to find me wherever you get your podcast, even YouTube. You can also follow my socials at Amorous Histories on Instagram and Facebook, and at Amorous Histpod on Twitter. Transcripts and sources are at amoroushistoriespodcast.wordpress.com. Please feel free to DM me or email me, amoroushistories@gmail.com, if you have any questions or even episode suggestions. The next episode will be on Beggar's Benison, and hopefully I will have gotten my act together by then.